The afternoon sun cast long, approving shadows across the vicarage lawn of St. Mary Mead, where the annual summer fete had arranged itself with the comfortable predictability of a well-rehearsed play. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading chestnut tree, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long practice, while her pale blue eyes surveyed the familiar scene with the gentle attention she might give to a favorite book read many times, but always capable of revealing some new detail. The bunting fluttered in the mild breeze, the coconut shy attracted its usual collection of optimistic young men, and Mrs. Pritchard counted her jam jars with the anxious precision of a bank clerk, pausing occasionally to adjust the ribbon on her prize-winning strawberry preserve. Lady Windermere stood near the tea-tent, a figure of austere elegance despite her advanced years, her silver hair perfectly arranged beneath a small black hat that had been fashionable when Queen Victoria still occupied the throne. She carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of one accustomed to deference, though Miss Marple noticed how her gloved hand trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of tea from young Mrs. Henderson. At her side, Miss Evelyn Grey, her companion of some 15 years, held a small lacquered casket with the careful attention one might give to a sleeping infant, her usually composed features showing signs of an inner agitation that expressed itself in the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot. The village had turned out in considerable numbers, drawn by curiosity as much as civic duty, for word had spread that Lady Windermere intended to make an announcement of some importance. Colonel Easterbrook, resplendent in his regimental blazer despite the warmth of the day, stood near the skittles discussing the weather with Dr. Haydock, though both men's attention kept drifting toward the elderly lady and her mysterious casket. Mr. Timothy Gaskell, Lady Windermere's great-nephew and presumed heir, lingered by the bookstall with an expression of barely concealed impatience, checking his pocket-watch with the frequency of a man awaiting news of considerable personal interest. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she observed the small drama unfolding near the rose arbor, where Mr. Lionel Pike, the antique dealer from Much Benham, attempted to engage Miss Grey in conversation. His manner was casual, almost diffident, but Miss Marple had known too many men who collected beautiful objects to mistake the sharp intelligence behind his mild exterior. Miss Grey's response was polite but firm, her grip on the casket tightening perceptibly as she shook her head and moved away. Mr. Pike's eyes followed the casket with the focused attention of a cat watching a particularly interesting mouse. The moment for Lady Windermere's announcement arrived, with the sort of natural ceremony that small villages manage so well. The Reverend Clement called for attention, his voice carrying easily across the lawn, and the various conversations gradually subsided into an expectant hush. Lady Windermere stepped forward, accepting the vicar's offered arm with a gracious nod, though Miss Marple noticed how heavily she leaned upon her walking stick as she moved to the small platform that had been erected beside the tea-tent. "My dear friends," Lady Windermere began, her voice still carrying the authority that had commanded respect in drawing-rooms from London to Edinburgh. "You have been kind enough to indulge an old woman's whims for many years, and today I wish to repay that kindness with what I hope will be my final gift to this community." She gestured toward the casket in Miss Grey's hands, and a ripple of anticipation moved through the assembled crowd. "The Windermere pearls, which have been in my family for 6 generations, will be sold at auction next month. The proceeds will fund the restoration of St. Catherine's North Aisle, ensuring that our little church remains a source of comfort and beauty for generations to come." The announcement was met with a murmur of appreciation and surprise, though Miss Marple noted the variety of expressions that flickered across the faces around her. Mrs. Pritchard looked frankly delighted, no doubt already composing the letter she would write to her sister in Bournemouth. Colonel Easterbrook nodded approvingly, as befitted a man who valued tradition and proper stewardship. Dr. Haydock appeared thoughtful, perhaps calculating the considerable sum such pearls might bring. Most interesting of all was young Timothy Gaskell's reaction. a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that suggested the announcement had not been entirely welcome news. Miss Grey stepped forward to place the casket on a small table that had been prepared for the purpose, her movements careful and deliberate. As she did so, Miss Marple observed a small detail that might have escaped less attentive eyes. The young woman's gloves, while appearing to match at first glance, were actually slightly different shades. One cream, the other ivory, as if one had been hastily substituted for its pair. It was the sort of minor imperfection that spoke of haste or distraction, qualities not usually associated with the meticulous Miss Grey. The formal viewing of the pearls was to take place in the vicarage study, Lady Windermere explained, where they would remain under lock and key until the auction house representatives arrived on Monday morning. The crowd began to move in that direction, conversations resuming with the animated quality that accompanies any significant social event. Miss Marple rose from her chair, gathering her knitting with unhurried movements, her mind already cataloguing the small inconsistencies and curious reactions she had observed. It was young Tommy Briggs who made the discovery, as children so often do in such matters, their natural curiosity leading them to places where adults fear to tread. His cry of alarm from the direction of the old stone folly at the garden's edge cut through the pleasant afternoon chatter like a knife through silk, bringing everything to an abrupt and terrible halt. Miss Grey lay crumpled on the folly's stone floor, her neat appearance dishevelled, her face bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. The lacquered casket was nowhere to be seen, and beside her lay the scattered fragments of what had once been a delicate teacup, its contents forming a small dark stain on the ancient stones. The silence that followed Tommy Briggs's cry was profound and terrible, as if the very air had been struck dumb by the sight before them. Then, like water breaking through a dam, voices and movement rushed toward the old stone folly, where Miss Grey lay motionless among the scattered fragments of delicate spode china. Dr. Haydock pushed through the gathering crowd with professional urgency, his medical bag already in hand, while Colonel Easterbrook took charge with military efficiency, directing the shocked villagers away from what was clearly now a crime scene. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic unhurried step, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail even as chaos swirled around her. The teacup had been shattered with considerable force, its contents forming a dark stain on the ancient stones that carried a faint, bitter scent she recognized but chose not to voice aloud. Miss Grey's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, one glove missing entirely while the remaining cream-colored one, the paler of the mismatched pair she had worn earlier, clung to her left hand. Most significantly, the lacquered casket containing the Windermere pearls had vanished without a trace. Dr. Haydock's examination was swift but thorough, his grim expression confirming what the gathering already feared. "She's gone," he announced quietly to the Reverend Clement, who had arrived breathless from telephoning the police. "No visible signs of struggle, but the circumstances." He gestured toward the broken porcelain and the empty space where the casket should have been. "We must wait for the authorities before disturbing anything further." Lady Windermere stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her usual commanding presence reduced to fragile bewilderment as she stared at her faithful companion's still form. Timothy Gaskell appeared at her side with unseemly haste, his face flushed as he guided his great-aunt away from the terrible sight, though Miss Marple noted how his eyes kept returning to the spot where the pearls had been. His solicitude seemed genuine enough, yet there was something in his manner that suggested the missing inheritance weighed heavily on his mind. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his familiar bulk and harried expression suggesting he had been enjoying his Saturday afternoon until duty called. He surveyed the scene with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to rural crimes, though Miss Marple suspected this particular case would prove more complex than his usual fare of poached rabbits and boundary disputes. Sergeant Fletcher accompanied him, notebook at the ready, his younger face reflecting genuine dismay at the sight of violent death in their peaceful village. The preliminary questioning began immediately, with Slack's heavy-handed approach yielding predictable results. Timothy Gaskell submitted to interrogation with ill-concealed impatience, his alibi seemingly solid. He had been discussing the church restoration with several parishioners when the tragedy occurred. Lady Windermere's responses came in whispered fragments, each word appearing to cost her considerable effort as she confirmed that Miss Grey had volunteered to secure the casket in the vicarage study, a routine task she had performed countless times before. Mr. Lionel Pike lingered at the edge of the proceedings, his antique dealer's composure cracked by something approaching genuine distress. When questioned, he spoke carefully of his brief conversation with Miss Grey, though he avoided mentioning his obvious interest in the casket's construction. Miss Marple observed the fine dust clinging to his otherwise immaculate shoes, and the way his eyes kept returning to the Folly's entrance, as if calculating distances and possibilities. The village gossip mill, that swift and potent current of rural life, began flowing almost immediately. Mrs. Pritchard declared it the work of an outsider, someone lured by news of the valuable pearls. Colonel Easterbrook spoke of opportunistic vagrants, while Dr. Haydock focused on the swift, efficient nature of the poisoning, assuming that was indeed what had occurred. Each theory revealed as much about the speaker as the crime itself, their assumptions colored by their own fears and prejudices. Miss Marple listened to the cacophony of speculation with the patient attention of a woman sorting through tangled wool. She noticed the profound grief etched on Lady Windermere's features, a sorrow that seemed to transcend the mere loss of valuable jewelry. The broken teacup continued to intrigue her. Why had Miss Grey been drinking tea in the Folly, and why had the cup been thrown or dropped with such force? The missing glove, the chipped heel of a sensible shoe, the bitter scent that lingered near the dark stain, all were pieces of a puzzle that Inspector Slack seemed determined to solve through conventional means. Young Tommy Briggs, still pale from his discovery, provided the only eyewitness account. He had heard voices from the Folly, Miss Grey saying, "No, not here," and a man's response, though a bird's harsh call had obscured the words. The mention of a hat was intriguing, though hardly conclusive in a village where most gentlemen wore them as a matter of course. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the search for the missing pearls began in earnest, though the trampled ground around the Folly offered little in the way of pristine evidence. The case appeared straightforward to Inspector Slack, a robbery gone wrong, with poor Miss Grey the unfortunate victim of someone's greed. Yet Miss Marple sensed deeper currents at work, the kind of complex human motivations that rarely yielded to simple explanations. The village had been shaken from its peaceful routine, and in that disruption lay the seeds of truth, waiting for the right observer to recognize their significance. The evening shadows lengthened across the vicarage grounds as Inspector Slack's methodical investigation continued under the harsh glare of police lanterns. The Folly, once a charming architectural whimsy, now stood transformed into a scene of calculated violence, its ancient stones bearing witness to secrets that daylight had failed to reveal. Miss Marple observed the proceedings from a respectful distance, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, while her mind catalogued the subtle details that seemed to escape official notice. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination had confirmed what the bitter scent near the shattered teacup had suggested. Miss Grey had been poisoned, swiftly and efficiently, by someone with knowledge of toxic substances. The post-mortem would reveal the specific agent, but the speed of death indicated a concentrated dose of something readily available to anyone familiar with the darker properties of common garden plants. Miss Marple made a mental note to examine her own herbaceous borders more carefully, recalling the various deadly species that grew so innocuously among more benign plantings. Inspector Slack's approach remained frustratingly conventional, focusing on the obvious motive of theft and the presumed involvement of an outsider. He had dispatched constables to question tradespeople and examine the roads for suspicious characters, convinced that the missing Windermere pearls represented the simple solution to a straightforward crime. His certainty was touching in its simplicity, though Miss Marple suspected he would find the truth considerably more elusive than his confident manner suggested. The broken teacup continued to intrigue her, particularly the force required to shatter the delicate spode so completely. The pattern of fragments suggested the cup had fallen from a considerable height or been thrown with deliberate violence, neither of which aligned with a simple collapse from poisoning. The dark stain on the ancient stones had spread in a manner indicating the liquid had been spilled while still hot, suggesting Miss Grey's final drink had been prepared with some ceremony or special purpose. Timothy Gaskell's behavior throughout the evening had been exemplary in its solicitude toward his great-aunt, yet Miss Marple detected an underlying current of calculation beneath his concerned exterior. His frequent glances toward the ongoing search suggested preoccupation with the missing inheritance, while his careful positioning near Lady Windermere spoke of a man suddenly aware of his enhanced responsibilities. The striped tie Colonel Easterbrook had mentioned remained a detail worth pursuing, particularly given young Tommy Briggs's account of voices from the folly. Lady Windermere herself presented a study in controlled grief, her usual imperious manner replaced by a fragility that seemed to age her before one's eyes. She spoke in broken sentences about Miss Grey's devotion, their 15 years together, the companion's quiet efficiency that had made declining years bearable. Yet beneath the genuine sorrow, Miss Marple detected something else, a quality of guilt or regret that suggested their relationship had been more complex than mere employer and employee. The missing glove remained perhaps the most intriguing detail of all. Miss Grey had been meticulous in her appearance, the sort of woman who would never knowingly wear mismatched accessories or leave one behind. The cream-colored glove that remained on her hand suggested its ivory companion had been lost during whatever confrontation led to her death. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the glove might have been deliberately removed, perhaps to prevent identification of someone who had handled the fatal teacup. Mr. Lionel Pike's departure for Much Benham shortly after giving his statement struck her as curious, particularly his claim of urgent business that could not wait despite the tragic circumstances. His professional interest in the casket's construction had seemed genuine, but professionals could be motivated by personal gain as easily as anyone else. The fine dust on his shoes, which he had attributed to the old summer house, deserved further investigation. The village gossip mill had begun its inevitable work, with theories proliferating like wildflowers after rain. Mrs. Pritchard favored the outsider theory, while Colonel Easterbrook spoke of professional criminals. Dr. Haydock focused on the swift efficiency of the poisoning, though his scientific mind seemed troubled by aspects of the crime that defied easy explanation. Each theory revealed as much about the speaker as the crime itself, their assumptions colored by personal fears and prejudices. As the official search continued around the folly and vicarage grounds, yielding nothing more significant than discarded sweet wrappers and a rusty hairpin, Miss Marple reflected on the curious timing of the tragedy. The pearls had been announced publicly only hours before Miss Grey's death, yet the crime seemed too well executed to have been planned on such short notice. This suggested either remarkable opportunism or prior knowledge of Lady Windermere's intentions. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though still too faint to discern clearly. Someone had known about the pearls, had planned for their acquisition, and had been prepared to kill when circumstances demanded it. The question was not whether the murder had been premeditated, but how long the perpetrator had been waiting for the right opportunity. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return home, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh revelations as the village's carefully maintained facades began to crumble under the pressure of official scrutiny. The morning after the tragedy dawned with deceptive serenity, the kind of crystalline clarity that often follows violent disruption, as if nature sought to compensate for human darkness with an excess of light and order. Miss Marple tended her herbaceous border with particular attention, noting how innocuous the foxgloves appeared in their neat rows, their purple bells concealing the cardiac poisons that could stop a heart within minutes. Her contemplation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's familiar, heavy tread on the garden path. His notebook clutched with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself close to resolution. She received him in her sitting room with customary courtesy, observing how his eyes swept the delicate china service with newfound wariness before accepting his cup. The parallel between her domestic ritual and the fatal tea that had claimed Miss Grey was not lost on either of them, though Slack's attention remained focused on more conventional aspects of detection. He had spent the early morning hours examining the crime scene with methodical thoroughness, and his preliminary findings painted an increasingly complex picture. The shattered teacup, he reported with growing confidence, had yielded significant information. Dr. Haydick's examination confirmed the presence of a potent cardiac glycoside, most likely derived from common garden plants, such as foxglove or lily of the valley. More intriguingly, the fragments themselves told a story that contradicted initial assumptions. The broken china was fine-spode with a delicate rose pattern, distinctly different from the plain white cups with blue trim that had been used at the tea tent during the fete. Miss Marple set down her own cup with deliberate care, her pale blue eyes reflecting keen interest. Then, poor Miss Grey's final tea did not come from the village refreshments. She observed gently. Someone had prepared it specially, using the vicarage's best china. The implications hung in the air between them like morning mist, suggesting premeditation rather than opportunistic poisoning. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose usually cheerful countenance bore the strain of recent events. She had come, she explained breathlessly, because she remembered something that might prove significant. Miss Grey had indeed requested tea in the vicar's study before securing the casket, but there had also been a telephone call for her, a long-distance connection from London that the operator had difficulty placing. Miss Grey had spoken in hushed tones, and when she emerged from the study, her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something approaching determination, as if she had reached some crucial decision. Inspector Slack's interest sharpened considerably at this revelation. A mysterious telephone call from London suggested connections beyond the village's narrow boundaries, possibilities that extended far beyond simple theft. He made careful notes while Mrs. Clement continued her account, describing how Miss Grey had specifically requested the rose-patterned spode rather than everyday china. Claiming it was for a special purpose she did not elaborate upon. The morning's most significant discovery came during Miss Marple's gentle exploration of the vicarage grounds, ostensibly to offer comfort to the bereaved household, but actually to observe details that official investigation might overlook. Near the hawthorn hedge that bordered the path between vicarage and churchyard, her sharp eyes detected a small white fragment caught on the thorns. Careful extraction with a knitting needle revealed a triangle of ivory kid leather, neatly stitched and unmistakably part of a lady's glove. The missing glove that had puzzled her from the beginning was beginning to yield its secrets. Miss Grey's meticulous nature would never have permitted mismatched accessories, yet she had worn one cream and one ivory glove to the fete. The ivory fragment on the hawthorn suggested a struggle or hasty movement along the back path. Someone who had torn their glove in a passage and been unable to retrieve it. Inspector Slack received this intelligence with grudging appreciation, though his focus remained fixed on more dramatic developments. The afternoon brought the discovery that would transform their understanding of the entire case. Young Tommy Briggs, still pale from his traumatic experience but determined to be helpful, led them to St. Catherine's Church, where his rubber ball had rolled behind the poor box during his morning exploration. There, wedged tightly between the ancient stone plinth and the wall, lay the missing casket, its black, lacquered surface gleaming like a reproachful eye in the dim church interior. Lady Windermere's key, when produced with trembling hands, would not turn in the lock. Someone had forced the mechanism, leaving telltale scratches around the keyhole that spoke of haste rather than expertise. When Inspector Slack finally pried open the damaged lock, the contents proved more shocking than the casket's disappearance. No luminous rope of ancestral pearls lay coiled within the velvet-lined interior. Instead, they found a small bundle of papers tied with ribbon and, beside them, a single bright bead that winked with the unmistakable cheapness of paste jewelry. The papers told their own story of deception and desperation. Receipts from a Bond Street establishment acknowledged recent repairs to a pearl clasp, while an older letter spoke delicately of restringing with the utmost discretion. Most damning of all was a jeweler's assessment noting that several pearls had been replaced with high-quality imitations over the years, suggesting financial pressures that had forced gradual liquidation of the family treasure. Miss Marple examined the evidence with growing understanding, her mind assembling the pieces of a puzzle far more complex than simple theft. The telephone call from London, the specially prepared tea service, the forced casket, and now the revelation of financial deception created a pattern that spoke of blackmail rather than robbery. Someone had known about the pearl's substitutions, had used that knowledge as leverage, and had ultimately killed to prevent exposure. The village's peaceful facade was crumbling under the weight of hidden secrets, revealing the complex web of deception, desperation, and long-buried shame that lay beneath its tranquil surface. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for the more delicate investigations that lay ahead, knowing that the truth would require understanding not just what had happened, but why human nature had demanded such a terrible price for its concealment. The shock of discovering the substituted pearls rippled through the assembled group like a stone dropped into still water, each person absorbing the implications according to their own fears and interests. Lady Windermere sat with the rigid composure of one who had lived too long with deception to be surprised by its exposure, though her gloved hands trembled as she reached for the bundle of papers that documented her family's gradual descent from prosperity to genteel poverty. Inspector Slack's satisfaction at solving what he had assumed to be a simple theft dissolved into the grimmer recognition that he was dealing with something far more complex than village opportunism. Miss Marple observed the reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature's revealing details. Timothy Gaskell's face cycled through surprise, calculation, and what appeared to be relief, suggesting he had suspected something of his great-aunt's financial difficulties. His quick movement to position himself as the family's protector spoke of a man already adjusting to changed circumstances, though whether from genuine concern or self-interest remained to be determined. Lady Windermere's confession, when it came, was delivered with the dignity of one who had carried the burden of deception too long to find relief in anything but truth. The financial pressures had been mounting for years, she explained with painful honesty. The great house demanded constant maintenance, the servants' wages could not be defaulted without destroying her social position, and her late husband's investments had proved far less secure than anyone had imagined. Miss Grey had been her only confidant in these matters, helping to arrange the discreet sales and equally discreet substitutions that had allowed the deception to continue undetected. This revelation cast the companion's loyalty in an entirely new light, transforming what had appeared to be devoted service into something approaching complicity. The mysterious telephone call from London began to make disturbing sense when Inspector Slack's inquiries revealed its true nature. The call had come from a firm of private inquiry agents, though their representative maintained professional discretion about their client's identity. The timing was crucial. The call had come just hours before Miss Grey's death, suggesting that someone had been investigating the pearl substitutions and had perhaps reached conclusions that threatened the carefully maintained deception. Miss Grey's decision to prepare special tea service and meet someone in the Folly spoke of a woman preparing for confrontation rather than casual conversation. Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the companion's final actions. The specially prepared spode teacup, the formal arrangement of the meeting, the careful timing, all suggested someone who had received information that demanded immediate action. But had Miss Grey been the victim of blackmail, or had she perhaps been the blackmailer herself, using her intimate knowledge of Lady Windermere's affairs to secure her own future? The thought was unsettling, for the companion had always appeared to epitomize loyalty and discretion, yet human nature rarely proved as straightforward as surface appearances suggested. The ivory glove fragment caught on the hawthorn hedge continued to puzzle the official investigation, though Miss Marple had begun to form theories about its significance. The tear pattern suggested hasty movement rather than careful passage. Someone who had been forced to use the back path between vicarage and churchyard without proper attention to obstacles. More significantly, the quality of the leather spoke of expensive accessories, the sort worn by someone with pretensions to gentility rather than genuine breeding. Miss Grey's meticulous nature would never have permitted mismatched gloves, yet she had worn one cream and one ivory to the fete. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination of the poison's effects provided additional pieces to the puzzle. The cardiac glycoside had been administered in a concentrated form that suggested careful preparation rather than hasty improvisation. The bitter taste would have been immediately apparent, meaning Miss Grey had either been forced to drink or had consumed the fatal dose willingly, perhaps believing it to be something else entirely. The swift onset of symptoms indicated someone with detailed knowledge of toxic plants and their proper preparation, narrowing the field of potential suspects to those with botanical expertise. The afternoon brought renewed focus on Mr. Lionel Pike, whose hasty departure for Much Benham now appeared more suspicious than merely inconsiderate. His professional interest in the casket's construction, he had claimed, was purely aesthetic, but the discovery of the forced lock and hidden papers suggested someone had been seeking more than artistic appreciation. Inspector Slack dispatched a constable to bring the antique dealer back for further questioning, his earlier dismissal of Pike's tools and expertise now seeming premature. Miss Marple made her own quiet investigation of the vicarage grounds, ostensibly to offer comfort to the bereaved household, but actually to observe details that official scrutiny might overlook. Near the side door of St. Catherine's Church, she discovered a faint scuff mark on the freshly painted jamb, containing traces of what appeared to be ivory kid leather. The mark was positioned too high to have been made by Miss Grey, suggesting someone taller had passed that way in haste, their expensive glove brushing against wet paint before the fete, and again more recently being torn on the hawthorn hedge. The case was revealing layers of deception and desperation that extended far beyond simple theft. Someone had been systematically investigating the pearl substitutions, gathering evidence that could destroy Lady Windermere's reputation and social position. Whether this investigation had been conducted with malicious intent or merely professional thoroughness remained unclear, but the resulting confrontation had proved fatal for the one person who knew all the family's secrets. Miss Marple gathered her observations and prepared for the more delicate investigations that lay ahead, knowing that the truth would require understanding not just what had happened, but why human nature had demanded such a terrible price for its concealment. The return of Mr. Lionel Pike under police escort created the sort of restrained sensation that village propriety demanded, though his demeanor suggested irritation rather than genuine concern as Inspector Slack conducted the renewed interrogation in the vicarage study. Miss Marple, invited to provide refreshments for the proceedings, positioned herself with characteristic discretion where she might observe the subtle interplay of question and response. Pike's explanation for his hasty departure proved disappointingly conventional, a prior engagement with a client in Much Benham regarding a Georgian silver service, supported by railway tickets and testimonials that left Inspector Slack visibly frustrated with their mundane reliability. The antique dealer's hands, Miss Marple noted with particular interest, bore the familiar stains of metal polish and wood treatments, but showed recent and thorough cleaning around the fingernails, as if someone had taken unusual care with their appearance. His expensive gloves, when produced for examination, revealed no damage, though their ivory-kid leather matched the fragment discovered on the hawthorn hedge. Pike's professional assessment of the casket's construction remained accurate, he insisted, though he admitted to curiosity about its valuable contents given Lady Windermere's public announcement. The afternoon's most significant development emerged from Mrs. Pritchard, whose passion for village observation had finally yielded information of genuine importance. Initially reluctant to speak, she eventually admitted to taking a shortcut through the vicarage grounds while pursuing her own investigation of the mysterious announcement. Her account placed a figure in dark clothing near the churchyard path, approximately 20 minutes before Miss Grey's discovery, moving with obvious purpose toward the folly while carrying what appeared to be a tea service on a small tray. Mrs. Pritchard's description remained frustratingly vague. Someone of medium height, wearing a dark coat and hat, pulled low, but her certainty about the timing provided crucial framework for understanding the crime's sequence. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to consider more carefully the domestic details that had been troubling her since the previous day. The rose-patterned spode service in the vicarage study had been incomplete, she realized, missing the second saucer that should have accompanied the shattered cup found beside Miss Grey's body. Mrs. Clement, when this discrepancy was mentioned with gentle curiosity, confirmed that Miss Grey had indeed requested the complete service after her telephone call from London. The companion had poured with her usual precision, Mrs. Clement recalled, though her manner had seemed unusually determined rather than merely dutiful. The missing saucer suggested either interrupted preparation or deliberate removal, the sort of detail that might indicate whether Miss Grey had been victim or participant in the fatal meeting. Timothy Gaskell's behavior throughout these developments continued to intrigue Miss Marple with its careful balance of solicitude and calculation. His frequent inquiries about the investigation's progress, his pointed questions about the London inquiry firm, and his subtle positioning near Lady Windermere during questioning all spoke of a man managing information as carefully as he managed his appearance. The expensive striped tie he had worn to the fete remained notably absent, replaced by appropriate mourning colors that somehow seemed more calculated than genuinely felt. Young Tommy Briggs, when questioned again with patient thoroughness, provided additional details that had been overlooked in the initial shock of discovery. The voices from the folly had included Miss Grey's firm "No, not here," and a man's response about "Your hat will be seen." Most significantly, Tommy described the hat as the straw kind, like at the races, with the dark stripe. A description that could apply to several gentlemen present at the fete, but carried particular resonance given the missing glove and paint smudge evidence. The scuff mark on St. Catherine's freshly painted door jamb continued to yield information under Miss Marple's patient observation. The mark's height suggested someone considerably taller than Miss Grey, while the ivory leather traces embedded in the cream paint matched the torn glove fragment exactly. Mr. Sims, the verger, confirmed that the paint had still been tacky at noon, meaning the mark had been made during or after the fete, rather than in preparation for it. Lady Windermere's condition had deteriorated markedly since the exposure of her financial deceptions, the combined shock of loss and revelation creating a fragility that concerned Dr. Haydock. Yet in her rambling reminiscences about Miss Grey's 15 years of service, she revealed unexpected details that cast their relationship in new light. The companion's occasional mysterious absences, her surprising knowledge of jewelry valuation, and her ability to maintain expensive personal accessories on a modest salary, all suggested circumstances more complex than devoted service. Most significantly, Lady Windermere recalled Miss Grey mentioning, just days before the fete, concerns about unscrupulous individuals who might seek to exploit family vulnerabilities. This conversation, initially dismissed as the companion's usual caution, now appeared prophetic given the systematic investigation that had culminated in the fatal confrontation. Dr. Haydock's final report on the poison's composition provided the most disturbing revelation yet. The cardiac glycoside had been extracted and concentrated with considerable botanical expertise, requiring several hours of careful preparation and precise knowledge of dosage. This ruled out any possibility of impulsive action, revealing instead a murder planned with scientific precision by someone who understood exactly how to achieve swift, certain death while minimizing detection risks. The case was revealing layers of deception that extended far beyond financial necessity into realms of blackmail, betrayal, and calculated murder. Someone had discovered Lady Windermere's secret, had used that knowledge to arrange a confrontation with Miss Grey, and had been prepared to kill rather than allow exposure of their own involvement. Miss Marple gathered her observations with growing certainty that the solution lay not in the obvious motives of greed or desperation, but in the more complex psychology of someone who had planned their crime with meticulous attention to detail while maintaining the perfect facade of village respectability. The morning after the Pearl revelation brought Inspector Slack to St. Catherine's Church with the methodical determination of a man convinced that systematic searching would eventually yield results, though Miss Marple suspected his approach might overlook the more subtle clues that human nature invariably provided. She had arrived earlier under the gentle pretext of arranging altar flowers, her pale blue eyes taking in details that official investigation might dismiss as insignificant. Mr. Sims, the verger, bustled about with officious importance, volunteering that he had locked up scrupulously the previous evening and that no unauthorized persons had been about the church, save perhaps Mrs. Pritchard counting poor box pennies with her usual air of civic duty. While Inspector Slack examined the area around the poor box where the casket had been discovered, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the chancel, where a corner of something white protruded from behind the oak moulding beneath the hymn-board. Her gloved fingers drew out a small parcel wrapped in a leaf torn from hymns ancient and modern, tied with frayed blue string. Inside lay a single saucer of the rose-patterned spode, its delicate surface bearing a faint brown ring of dried tea and, more significantly, a tiny smudge of cream paint that matched the freshly painted vestry door jamb. The saucer carried the faint, bitter scent that she had learned to associate with foxglove preparations, and a crescent-shaped abrasion where a cup handle had pressed hard before being lifted away in haste. The discovery of the missing saucer completed the domestic picture that had been troubling her methodical mind. Miss Grey had indeed prepared tea for two, using Lady Windermere's finest china for what she had clearly considered a meeting of considerable importance. The careful concealment of the saucer behind the hymn-board spoke of someone who understood the church's layout intimately and had sufficient presence of mind to hide evidence even in the aftermath of murder. This suggested not panic, but calculated planning, the sort of methodical approach that characterized someone accustomed to managing appearances and concealing inconvenient truths. Inspector Slack's satisfaction at this new evidence was interrupted by the arrival of a square-shouldered gentleman whose neat moustache and urban briskness proclaimed London origins even before he presented his visiting card. Mr. Rourke of Harborough and Rourke, inquiry agents, apologized with polished courtesy for intruding upon parish business, explaining that his firm had been engaged to verify certain valuations and that he had been the voice on the telephone to Miss Grey on Saturday. His preliminary findings, he reported with professional discretion, had been of a sensitive nature, and he had arranged to deliver his full written report on Monday noon. Since his first copy had been posted to Miss Grey at Windermere House and circumstances had prevented delivery, he had brought a duplicate for Inspector Slack's consideration. The revelation that someone had commissioned professional investigation into the Windermere pearls transformed the case from village tragedy to calculated exposure of long-held secrets. When pressed about his client's identity, Mr. Rourke maintained professional ethics, but noted that payment had been made by check drawn on Bryce and Tolliver's Much Benham branch, an inference that pointed directly toward Timothy Gaskell and his modest account there. The young man's subsequent confession, delivered with the heated indignation of someone caught in an uncomfortable truth, revealed motivations that were both filial and self-interested. He had suspected his great-aunt's financial difficulties and wished to prevent public humiliation while protecting his own inheritance prospects. Timothy's account of his telephone conversation with Miss Grey painted a picture of two people equally anxious about the impending exposure but disagreeing about the proper response. The companion had insisted on proceeding with her plan to demonstrate respectability by serving tea properly in the vicarage study, while Timothy had reluctantly agreed to meet her beforehand for private discussion. His nervous energy during the telling, combined with the pale stripe of fresh paint on his coat cuff and the thin scratch on his signet ring, suggested someone who had indeed been present at the crime scene, though whether as perpetrator or discoverer remained unclear. Miss Marple's quiet investigation of the village's other residents yielded additional pieces to the increasingly complex puzzle. Colonel Easterbrook's regimental boater, with its distinctive dark ribbon, lay prominently displayed on his hall table, and his admission to retrieving a skittle ball near the churchyard path placed him in the vicinity during crucial moments. More significantly, the hat showed a faint splash on its brim that he could not identify, though Miss Marple's experienced eye recognized the sort of staining that occurred when liquid was spilled or thrown with considerable force. The botanical expertise required for the concentrated poison preparation continued to intrigue her, particularly given the village's limited pool of residents with such specialized knowledge. Dr. Haydick's scientific background and known interest in medicinal plants made him an obvious candidate, yet his genuine distress at Miss Grey's death and his methodical approach to the post-mortem examination suggested a man dedicated to healing rather than harming. The contradiction between means and character troubled her systematic approach to human nature. As evening approached, the investigation took another disturbing turn when Mr. Sims discovered evidence of attempted arson in St. Catherine's North Aisle. Among the charred remains of old hymnals, Inspector Slack found fragments of a manila envelope and typewritten pages dense with valuations and references to pearl substitutions. Most significantly, a melted hatpin with a distinctive dark enamel band lay among the ashes, its steel shank bent and partially fused from the heat. The attempted destruction of evidence spoke of desperation and intimate knowledge of the church's layout, someone who had access to both the building and the original inquiry agent's report that Miss Grey had been meant to receive. The pattern was becoming clearer to Miss Marple's experienced eye, though the final revelation remained tantalizingly beyond reach. Someone had commissioned the investigation, arranged the fatal meeting, and subsequently attempted to destroy evidence of their involvement. The killer possessed botanical knowledge, intimate familiarity with village routines, and the calculating intelligence to frame others while maintaining their own facade of respectability. The truth lay not in the obvious motives of greed or desperation, but in the more complex psychology of someone who had planned their crime with meticulous attention to detail while prepared to sacrifice anyone who threatened their carefully constructed deception. The discovery of the melted hatpin among the charred remains sent ripples of unease through St. Mary Mead that extended far beyond the obvious implications of arson and evidence destruction. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the domestic details that official investigation might overlook, those small betrayals of habit and composure that revealed more about human nature than any formal interrogation. She began her morning with a gentle visit to the vicarage under the pretext of returning a borrowed book of devotions, her pale blue eyes taking in the subtle changes that stress and guilt inevitably produced in even the most carefully maintained households. Mrs. Clement received her in the morning room with a composure that seemed brittle around the edges, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the sort of determined pleasantness that spoke of considerable inner turmoil. Miss Marple noted immediately the small blister on the vicar's wife's left thumb, the kind that resulted from handling hot metal without proper protection, and the conspicuous absence of the dark enamel-banded hat-pin that had been such a consistent feature of her recent appearances. When complimented on the lovely arrangement of foxgloves in the church the previous day, Mrs. Clement's response carried a nervous quality that had not been present before the tragedy. The conversation drifted naturally to the shocking discovery of attempted arson, and Mrs. Clement's account of finding the smoldering hymnals revealed several interesting details. She had been conducting a final check of the church before evening prayers, she explained, when the acrid smell of smoke had drawn her to the north aisle. Her description of stamping out the flames with her own hands explained the blister, though Miss Marple noticed how carefully she avoided mentioning whether she had been alone during this heroic effort. The cream paint smudge on the morning room windowsill, hastily cleaned but still faintly visible, suggested someone had been washing their hands with unusual thoroughness. Inspector Slack's more conventional investigation had yielded frustratingly little progress, though his systematic approach to the hatpin evidence was beginning to narrow the field of possibilities. The melted accessory's distinctive design had been traced to a London milliner who catered to ladies of refined taste but modest means, the sort of establishment that understood the importance of maintaining appearances regardless of financial circumstances. The purchase records, when finally obtained through official channels, would prove illuminating. Though Miss Marple suspected the truth lay closer to home than such formal inquiries might reveal. Her next visit took her to Windermere House, where Lady Windermere's condition had deteriorated markedly since the exposure of the pearl deception. The old lady received her with touching gratitude, clearly finding comfort in Miss Marple's gentle presence amid the chaos that had engulfed her carefully ordered world. Timothy Gaskell's nervous energy had intensified into barely controlled agitation, his frequent consultations with his pocket watch and his anxious glances toward the window suggesting a man awaiting news of considerable personal importance. The household's domestic routines had been disrupted in ways that spoke of more than mere grief and confusion. The usual afternoon tea service had been replaced by a simple tray arrangement that avoided the rose-patterned spode entirely, as if the very sight of such china had become unbearable. More significantly, Miss Marple observed that the morning room's small writing desk bore fresh scratches around the lock, the sort of damage that resulted from hasty attempts to secure or retrieve important documents. The key, when Lady Windermere produced it with trembling hands, showed similar signs of recent use under stressful circumstances. Dr. Haydock's professional visits to the household had increased in frequency, his medical bag now containing what appeared to be additional bottles and preparations beyond his usual supplies. His conversations with Timothy had taken on a conspiratorial quality that ceased abruptly when others approached, suggesting discussions of matters that extended beyond Lady Windermere's immediate health concerns. The doctor's botanical expertise, combined with his intimate knowledge of the household's routines and vulnerabilities, continued to place him in a position of considerable interest regarding the poison's preparation and administration. The afternoon brought a development that cast new light on the investigation's direction, when young Tommy Briggs, emboldened by his previous importance to the case, reported seeing a figure near the vicarage garden late the previous evening. His description of someone moving with obvious purpose toward the back entrance, carrying what appeared to be a small bundle, provided crucial timing information that aligned with the attempted arson. More significantly, Tommy's account of hearing the distinctive sound of breaking glass shortly before the figure's departure suggested the destruction of evidence that extended beyond the burned papers. Miss Marple's careful examination of the vicarage grounds revealed additional clues that painted an increasingly clear picture of the previous evening's activities. Near the kitchen garden, she discovered fragments of what had once been a small medicine bottle, its label too damaged to read, but bearing traces of the same bitter residue that had characterized the fatal tea service. The bottle's position, carefully buried beneath a pile of garden refuse, spoke of someone familiar with the property's layout and confident of avoiding detection. The psychological pressure of the ongoing investigation was manifesting in increasingly revealing ways throughout the village. Colonel Easterbrook's military bearing had developed a defensive quality that suggested a man under siege, while his usual forthright manner had been replaced by careful evasion when questioned about his movements during crucial periods. The splash on his regimental boater, initially dismissed as a bird dropping, had resisted all attempts at cleaning and continued to emit a faint, familiar bitterness when examined closely. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging from the accumulated evidence and observations. The crime had been planned with meticulous attention to domestic detail by someone who understood village routines intimately and possessed the botanical knowledge necessary for poison preparation. The subsequent attempts to destroy evidence and deflect suspicion revealed a mind capable of swift adaptation to changing circumstances, yet ultimately betrayed by the very human tendency to manage appearances through small, revealing actions. The truth lay not in dramatic revelations, but in the quiet accumulation of domestic inconsistencies that spoke more eloquently than any confession of the terrible price that respectability could demand from those who sought to preserve it at any cost. The morning after the arson discovery brought with it the kind of oppressive quiet that settles over communities when secrets begin to surface, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to the vicarage with the purposeful intent that her neighbors had learned to recognize as significant. She arrived to find Mrs. Clement engaged in what appeared to be an unusually thorough clearing of the herbaceous border, her movements displaying the sort of methodical determination that spoke of more than routine gardening. The foxgloves, which had been such a prominent feature of the recent church arrangements, were being systematically uprooted and consigned to a bonfire that sent acrid smoke drifting across the peaceful morning air. Inspector Slack's arrival interrupted this domestic scene with news that transformed speculation into near certainty. The London milliner's records had finally yielded their secrets, revealing that a Mrs. Clement had indeed purchased a hat pin with distinctive dark enamel banding, paying in cash during a visit to her married sister 3 weeks prior. When confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Clement's initial composure cracked slightly. Her explanation that the pin had been a small self-indulgence delivered with the sort of defensive pride that often accompanies guilt. Miss Marple observed the way the vicar's wife's hands trembled as she spoke, and how her eyes kept drifting toward the smouldering garden refuse as if calculating what evidence might yet remain unconsumed. The afternoon brought a development that cast the investigation in an entirely new and alarming light. Lady Windermere, who had been showing signs of recovery from the shock of recent revelations, suddenly collapsed during tea at Windermere House, her breathing shallow and her pulse racing with the telltale symptoms of cardiac distress. Dr. Haydock's swift examination revealed signs of digitalis poisoning, though in a much milder form than had claimed Miss Grey's life. The medicine chest in Lady Windermere's room showed signs of recent tampering, with one bottle bearing traces of the same bitter residue that had characterized the fatal tea service at the Folly. Timothy Gaskell's explanation for his presence near the medicine chest the previous evening seemed plausible enough. He had been fetching his great-aunt's sleeping draught at Dr. Haydock's direction. Yet Miss Marple noted how his nervous energy had intensified into barely controlled agitation. His frequent consultations with his pocket watch and his anxious glances toward the windows suggested a man awaiting news of considerable personal importance, though whether from guilt or fear remained unclear. The young man's relief when Lady Windermere's condition stabilized was genuine, yet his immediate inquiries about the investigation's progress spoke of priorities that extended beyond mere familial concern. Miss Marple's careful examination of the medicine chest revealed details that painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic tampering. The bottle containing Lady Windermere's digitalis preparation showed signs of having been opened and resealed, with traces of a more concentrated solution around the stopper that matched the bitter scent she had learned to associate with the murder weapon. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household's routines and access to both botanical expertise and pharmaceutical preparations had attempted a second poisoning, perhaps to silence the one person who might remember crucial details about Miss Grey's final days. The psychological pressure of these developments manifested most clearly in Mrs. Clement, whose usually composed demeanor had been replaced by a brittle nervousness that expressed itself in compulsive domestic activities. Her afternoon visit to Windermere House, ostensibly to offer comfort and prayer, provided Miss Marple with the opportunity to observe the vicar's wife's reactions to the scene of the attempted second poisoning. The way Mrs. Clement's eyes swept the medicine chest with professional assessment, her immediate questions about the bottle's contents, and her visible relief when assured that Lady Windermere would recover, all spoke of someone with more than casual interest in the proceedings. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her decision to force the final confrontation through the sort of subtle psychological pressure that had served her so well in previous cases. She sent carefully worded invitations to 3 individuals, each note crafted to exploit specific anxieties and compel attendance at what she described as an informal tea to discuss certain matters connected with Lady Windermere's gift. To Mrs. Clement, she mentioned a misplaced hatpin she believed might belong to the vicar's wife. To Timothy Gaskell, she hinted at additional documents that Mr. Rourke had recovered. To Colonel Easterbrook, she simply requested his advice on a matter of considerable delicacy. The domestic preparations for this gathering were arranged with a sort of careful attention to detail that would appear merely fussy to anyone less observant than a murderer. Miss Marple set her small cottage table with deliberate precision, placing the plain blue-banded cups from the church tea-tent alongside the rose-patterned spode service that had played such a crucial role in the original crime. On the sideboard, she arranged a small bouquet of foxgloves, their purple bells as innocent-seeming as sin often appeared before it was properly named. The stage was set for the final act of a drama that had begun with Lady Windermere's generous announcement and would end with the exposure of secrets that had demanded the terrible price of murder to keep them hidden. The truth lay not in the obvious motives of greed or desperation, but in the more complex psychology of someone who had planned their crime with meticulous attention to detail while maintaining the perfect facade of village respectability. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for the delicate work that lay ahead, knowing that tomorrow would bring either confession or the sort of psychological revelation that would make official charges inevitable. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to witness the final unraveling of a deception that had cost one life and nearly claimed another, all in service of maintaining the appearances that meant more than truth to those who had forgotten the difference between respectability and genuine virtue. The afternoon light filtering through Miss Marple's cottage windows carried the golden quality that often accompanies moments of truth, casting her carefully arranged parlor in sharp relief as her 3 guests arrived with the punctuality that anxiety invariably produces. Mrs. Clement entered first, her usual composed demeanor betrayed by the way her eyes immediately swept the room, lingering on the innocent bouquet of foxgloves and the rose-patterned spode service with unmistakable recognition. Timothy Gaskell followed, his nervous energy barely contained as he positioned himself near the window, while Colonel Easterbrook completed the gathering with military precision, though Miss Marple noted how his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he removed his regimental boater and placed it deliberately on the sideboard, far from the purple bells that seemed to watch the proceedings with silent accusation. Miss Marple poured tea with her characteristic unhurried grace, her pale blue eyes missing nothing as she offered the carefully prepared service. To Timothy and the Colonel, she presented cups from the plain blue-banded set used at the church fete, but for Mrs. Clement, she extended the rose-patterned spode with its delicate saucer, the very china that had played such a crucial role in the original crime. As the steam rose from the elegant cup, carrying with it the faintest trace of bitterness, no more than a whisper of harmless gentian from a countrywoman's digestive, Mrs. Clement's hand, already moving to accept, withdrew sharply. The vicar's wife recovered almost immediately, choosing instead a plain cup with an apologetic smile that fooled no one present, least of all Miss Marple, whose gentle expression remained unchanged even as she noted this telling reaction. The conversation began with the sort of gentle observations that had served Miss Marple so well in previous cases, her knitting needles moving with familiar rhythm as she spoke of gardens and their hidden dangers. She mentioned, almost casually, how the investigation had revealed such interesting details about the botanical expertise required for concentrated digitalist preparation, the sort of knowledge that might be found in someone who arranged church flowers regularly and maintained an extensive herbaceous border. Mrs. Clement's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the cottage's peaceful atmosphere, while her eyes kept drifting toward the foxglove arrangement as if drawn by some terrible magnetism. Timothy Gaskell's agitation increased markedly as Miss Marple began discussing the inquiry agent's report and the systematic investigation that had preceded Miss Grey's death. His confession tumbled out with the relief of a man who could no longer bear the weight of concealed knowledge. Yes, he had commissioned Mr. Rourke's investigation, but his motives had been protective rather than malicious. He had suspected his great-aunt's financial difficulties and wished to prevent public humiliation while securing his inheritance. But he swore with desperate sincerity that he had never intended harm to anyone. His account of warning Miss Grey to be careful, of urging discretion about "your hat will be seen," explained young Tommy's overheard conversation and cleared him of direct involvement in the murder itself. Miss Marple listened to this protestation with the patience of one who understood guilt's many manifestations, though her attention remained focused on Mrs. Clement's increasingly pale complexion. The revelation that transformed speculation into certainty came when she produced from her work basket the hidden saucer recovered from behind St. Catherine's hymn-board, its delicate surface bearing not only the telltale brown ring of dried tea, but also a tiny smudge of cream paint that matched the vestry door jamb exactly. The saucer had been hidden with the sort of methodical care that spoke of someone intimately familiar with the church's layout, someone who understood that tidiness could serve as both refuge and concealment. The psychological pressure of this methodical revelation proved too much for Mrs. Clement's carefully maintained composure. Her confession, when it finally came, was delivered with the sort of desperate honesty that follows the collapse of long-maintained deception. She had indeed overheard Miss Grey's telephone conversation with the London inquiry agent during her afternoon visit to the vicarage, and the companion's determination to proceed with full disclosure had triggered a panic that led to increasingly desperate measures. The concentrated digitalis had been prepared in her own kitchen using foxgloves from her carefully tended garden, the bitter taste disguised by strong tea and the formality of the occasion she had arranged under the pretext of discussing how best to protect Lady Windermere's reputation. The meeting at the Folly had been her suggestion when Miss Grey refused to meet at the vicarage study where they might be observed, and the careful preparation of the rose-patterned service had been intended to lend dignity to what she had desperately hoped would be a conversation about discretion rather than disclosure. But Miss Grey's unwavering commitment to honesty, her refusal to consider concealment even to protect the parish from scandal, had made the final, terrible step seem inevitable to a woman whose world was built upon the careful maintenance of appearances. The concentrated dose had been intended merely to frighten, she insisted with heartbreaking sincerity, not to kill. She had simply misjudged the strength required, her botanical knowledge proving fatally imprecise when applied with trembling hands and a desperate heart. The attempted destruction of evidence in the church fire had been a panicked afterthought, as had the subsequent attempt to silence Lady Windermere before she could remember crucial details about Miss Grey's final days. Mrs. Clement's intimate familiarity with village routines and her access to both church and vicarage had made the crimes technically feasible, but her fundamental decency had prevented her from completing the second murder when faced with the reality of what she had become. The confession concluded with a plea for understanding that Miss Marple received with the compassion of one who had witnessed too many tragedies born of good intentions corrupted by fear and pride. At that moment, as if summoned by the weight of truth itself, Inspector Slack's familiar bulk appeared in the doorway, his timing suggesting he had been waiting nearby for precisely this moment. His approach was tactful, almost gentle, as he addressed Mrs. Clement with the sort of awkward sympathy that good men show when duty demands unpleasant actions. The arrest was conducted with quiet dignity. Mrs. Clement's final words a whispered apology to Miss Marple for the deception and to her absent husband for the shame she had brought upon his calling. As they departed, the cottage seemed to exhale slowly, the afternoon light softening as if nature itself sought to ease the harshness of human revelation. Timothy remained behind, along with Colonel Easterbrook, both men visibly shaken by the exposure of depths they had never suspected in their quiet village. The colonel's role had been that of an unwitting accomplice, his military sense of duty manipulated by Mrs. Clement's careful appeals to his protective instincts. His regimental boater borrowed and returned with the telltale stain that might have implicated him had the investigation followed more conventional paths. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of one who had seen justice served, though her pale blue eyes reflected the sorrow that always accompanied such revelations. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead would return to its routines, but with the sobering knowledge that even the most respectable facades could conceal the terrible prices that fear and pride could demand from those who confused respectability with genuine virtue. The quiet that settled over Miss Marple's cottage parlor after Inspector Slack's departure carried the weight of revelation and the peculiar emptiness that follows the exposure of long-held secrets. Timothy Gaskell remained by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, while Colonel Easterbrook sat rigid in his chair, both men struggling to reconcile the woman they had known with the calculating murderer who had just confessed in this very room. The rose-patterned Spode service sat abandoned on the tea-table, its delicate beauty now forever associated with the terrible knowledge of how easily domestic tranquility could mask deadly intent. Timothy was the first to find his voice, turning from the window with the slow movements of a man who had aged considerably in the past hour. His earlier concerns about inheritance and family reputation seemed petty now in the face of such genuine tragedy, and his stammered apologies to Miss Marple revealed a young man finally grasping the true consequences of his well-intentioned meddling. The inquiry agent's investigation, commissioned to protect the family's dignity, had instead provided the very knowledge that made murder seem necessary to a desperate woman. Colonel Easterbrook's response was more profound, his military bearing crumbling as he realized how easily his protective instincts had been manipulated, his borrowed hat serving as an unwitting prop in a drama of deception that had cost Miss Grey her life. The news of Mrs. Clement's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that only village communication networks could achieve, though the usual relish for scandal was notably absent. The revelation that their vicar's wife, a woman who had embodied parish virtue and respectability, could commit such calculated murder, struck at the very foundations of community trust. Mrs. Pritchard found herself uncharacteristically subdued, her theories about outsiders and professional criminals now seeming pathetically inadequate in the face of such domestic horror. The vicarage itself stood shrouded in an atmosphere of profound sorrow, its carefully maintained domesticity revealed as a facade that had concealed planning and preparation for murder behind the respectable routine of flower arrangements and parish duties. Reverend Clement bore his wife's disgrace with the quiet dignity that his calling demanded, though the shock had visibly aged him in the space of a few days. His sermons took on a quality of profound humility that spoke of a man wrestling with the terrible discovery that evil could flourish so close to home, nurtured by the very virtues he had spent his life celebrating. The community rallied around him with protective sympathy, understanding that he too was a victim of the deception that had destroyed so many lives. The stained glass windows of St. Catherine's seemed to reflect the collective heartache of a village forced to confront the fragility of its own cherished illusions. The trial, when it came, was conducted with the restrained dignity that provincial justice could achieve when dealing with defendants who retained the community's reluctant sympathy. Mrs. Clement's defense relied heavily on the unpremeditated nature of the fatal dose, her lawyer arguing that botanical inexperience, rather than murderous intent, had caused Miss Grey's death. The accumulated evidence told its own story of methodical planning corrupted by panic. The rose-patterned saucer, hidden with meticulous care, the torn glove fragment caught on hawthorn thorns, the melted hatpin dropped into hastily kindled flames. The verdict reflected the jury's understanding that good intentions corrupted by fear and pride could produce consequences as terrible as any malicious design. Though the sentence acknowledged both the gravity of the crime and the circumstances that had driven a previously respectable woman to such desperate measures. Lady Windermere's recovery from the second poisoning attempt proceeded slowly, complicated by the psychological burden of knowing that her companion's death had resulted from her own financial deceptions. The old lady's decision to sell Windermere House and relocate to a modest cottage represented more than financial necessity. It was a conscious choice to abandon the pretenses that had cost so much to maintain. A long-overlooked painting in the morning room, dismissed for years as a faded copy, proved under expert examination to be a valuable work that provided the funds necessary for both her modest retirement and St. Catherine's restoration. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that truth, when finally embraced, often proved more valuable than the deceptions it replaced. Timothy Gaskell's inheritance, when it eventually came, was considerably smaller than he had imagined, though he had learned lessons about the true cost of respectability that would serve him better than any monetary legacy. His regular afternoon walks with Lady Windermere, matching his pace to her walking-stick's gentle measure rather than his own impatience, spoke of a young man who had finally understood the difference between duty and self-interest. Colonel Easterbrook quietly retired his regimental boater with its telltale stain, replacing it with a simple Panama that carried no associations with the tragedy that had shaken his orderly world. The village itself gradually returned to its customary routines, though with subtle changes that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Herbaceous borders throughout the community were quietly modified, with foxgloves and other potentially dangerous plants relocated where their beauty could be appreciated without constant reminder of their deadly potential. Dr. Haydock's medical practice took on a more cautious approach to botanical remedies, his previous enthusiasm for natural preparations tempered by knowledge of how easily healing could be transformed into harm. Miss Marple resumed her quiet observation of human nature with the satisfaction of one who had seen justice served, though her pale blue eyes reflected the sorrow that always accompanied such revelations. The case had reminded her once again that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most carefully maintained facades, and that the price of preserving appearances could sometimes prove more costly than the truth they sought to conceal. As she gathered her knitting and prepared for the evening's quiet reflection, she considered how Mrs. Clement's desperate attempt to protect the parish's reputation had ultimately destroyed it more thoroughly than any scandal Miss Grey might have revealed. The peaceful community of St. Mary Mead would continue its gentle existence, but with the sobering knowledge that respectability and virtue were not synonymous, and that even the most familiar neighbors could harbor depths that defied easy understanding. The trout. The summer had yielded to autumn's gentle embrace when St. Catherine's north aisle reopened with quiet ceremony, the restored stonework gleaming in the slanted afternoon light that seemed to bless the gathered congregation. Miss Marple occupied her customary place toward the back, her pale blue eyes moving with familiar precision across the assembled faces that told their own stories of healing and transformation. Lady Windermere, dignified in dove-grey silk that spoke of acceptance rather than mourning, stood beside the simple brass plaque that would commemorate both her final gift and Miss Grey's faithful service. The inscription, chosen with careful deliberation, read simply, "In memory of Evelyn Gray, devoted companion, and in thanksgiving for truth courageously embraced." Timothy Gaskell's presence beside his great-aunt carried none of his former restless ambition. His manner, reflecting the hard-won wisdom that tragedy sometimes bestows upon the fortunate. His engagement to Dr. Haydock's niece, announced with quiet joy rather than social fanfare, suggested a young man who had finally learned to distinguish between inheritance and legacy. Colonel Easterbrook stood straighter than he had in months, his military bearing restored by the peculiar relief that comes from abandoning pretense, his new Panama hat casting no shadows of the past. Even Mrs. Pritchard seemed subdued by genuine understanding, her usual appetite for gossip tempered by knowledge of words' power to heal or harm. Reverend Clement's blessing carried the weight of authentic experience, his voice steady despite the empty space where his wife should have been. The vicarage had found new rhythms under Mrs. Patterson's brisk management, its domestic perfection replaced by genuine warmth that welcomed imperfection as part of human experience. The rose-patterned spode service had been quietly donated to the church jumble sale, purchased by unknowing hands that would fill it with innocent celebrations rather than deadly schemes. As the ceremony concluded and the congregation dispersed into the golden afternoon, Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple with the careful respect that their shared experience had earned. "You had it sorted early, didn't you, Miss Marple?" he asked, his earlier frustration replaced by genuine curiosity. "The glove, the saucer, the paint smudges. I kept looking for thieves and coshers when the answer was in teacups and garden borders." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm as she considered his question. "People do so often expect dramatic solutions, Inspector, when the truth usually lies in domestic details." Mrs. Clement's mismatched gloves told the real story. A meticulous woman would never wear ivory and cream together unless circumstances had forced improvisation. The hidden saucer confirmed she had prepared tea for two, while the paint traces revealed her hasty passage through the church. It was rather like my great-aunt's housemaid who kept breaking dessert plates while trying to prove she never broke anything. The very effort to maintain perfection became the source of destruction. Dr. Haydock joined their conversation, his medical expertise having been both crucial and insufficient for understanding the crime's true nature. The botanical knowledge required for that concentrated digitalis preparation, he mused, suggested someone with considerable expertise. Yet the real poison was fear itself, fear of exposure, of losing respectability, of facing uncomfortable truth. The months that followed brought gradual healing to St. Mary Mead, though the scars of deception would remain visible to those who understood their significance. Lady Windermere's cottage became a place of unexpected contentment, its modest rooms filled with the warmth that genuine simplicity could provide. Her afternoon teas, served on cheerful everyday china, attracted visitors who valued honesty over ceremony and found refreshment in conversations unencumbered by pretense. The sale of her overlooked painting had provided both the funds for church restoration and a comfortable independence that required no maintenance of false appearances. The village itself underwent subtle transformations that reflected collective wisdom earned through shared suffering. The annual summer fete, when it returned, was conducted with quiet celebration rather than elaborate display, its organizers having learned to value community over spectacle. Herbaceous borders throughout the community were quietly modified, with foxgloves and other potentially dangerous plants relocated where their beauty could be appreciated without constant reminder of their deadly potential. Mrs. Clement's letters from prison, delivered through her husband's discreet mediation, spoke of genuine repentance and growing understanding of how small compromises with truth could accumulate into devastating consequences. The woman who had killed to preserve respectability had finally learned the difference between reputation and character, though the lesson had come at a price that would shadow her remaining days. As winter settled over the peaceful village, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the strange alchemy by which tragedy could be transformed into wisdom. The case had reminded her once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who began with admirable motives, their initial virtue providing both means and justification for increasingly desperate measures. Mrs. Clement's genuine love for her parish had been corrupted by fear into something unrecognizable, demonstrating how easily good intentions could be twisted when guided by pride rather than wisdom. The evening light filtering through her cottage windows carried the golden quality of acceptance as Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for quiet reflection. She moved the small vase of foxgloves from her mantel to the outer window-sill, where their purple bells could be appreciated for their beauty without any association with human folly. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, a recognition that even dangerous things could find their proper place when handled with understanding rather than deception. Miss Grey's final service to her community, Miss Marple reflected, had been to reveal through her death the courage required to choose truth over comfortable lies. The village would remember this lesson, and in that remembrance lay the only redemption that tragedy could offer, the hope that wisdom gained through suffering might prevent future generations from repeating the same costly mistakes. The peaceful community of St. Mary Mead would continue its gentle existence, but with the sobering knowledge that genuine virtue required not the skill to maintain appearances, but the courage to face uncomfortable truths with grace and honesty. Di had taught them all that love, when it turned fearful, could demand terrible sacrifices, and that the last gift anyone could offer was often the truth they had tried so desperately to avoid. In the end, the village had learned to value honesty over appearances, understanding that genuine virtue required the courage to face uncomfortable truths rather than the skill to conceal them behind domestic perfection and social propriety.